Worst job ever, worst client ever, worst employee ever. These are things we hope we never have to say or hear about ourselves in any conversation. But as we are talking, I'm sure you can think of at least one person at work that made you go, worst ever.
Welcome to this episode of Small Talk with Raincraft, where we discuss hiring, firing, and everything in between, particularly when we don't get to actually see each other. I'm Subha.
And I'm Hasita. A bad hiring choice or landing a bad gig is actually more common than we think. 3 in 4 employers around the world have hired the wrong person for a job and paid the price, quite literally. This rather high percentage is interesting because none of us actually set out to find a bad person to hire, right? And yet, it happens time and time again. Perhaps the real question to answer then is this: what goes into hiring right?
So much of bringing a new person into a team has to do with the company's own culture and values. When we set out to hire someone, we usually talk about all of the problems we'd like them to solve for us, without ever stopping to consider our own environment and culture. For example, a job description will ask for a go-getter or a people person, but that's not a qualifier really. If you weren't a go-getter or a people person, you'd probably not be hired anyway.
True, it's a bit like a restaurant saying we use strict hygiene measures, which actually is the baseline expectation when it comes to a place where we eat. Speaking of job descriptions, I've also encountered some which are quite simply a list of ideal attributes, and this applies to both the skills and the qualities they're looking for. There are several job postings that ask, specifically in marketing, because that's where I've seen the most job descriptions too. They ask for experience in copywriting, SEO, campaign planning, brand strategy, and sometimes even Photoshop. Well, to be honest, that isn't an individual they're looking for, that's called a team.
The first tenet of hiring right really is to actually know what you want. And not just from the perspective of skills, but also from the culture aspect. On a podcast called At the Table with Patrick Lencioni, there's an episode on this very subject, and I love some of the ideas they put out there. The first one is that a company's culture is not just a list of 10 words that sound aspirational, but a list of 3 words that are actually true. So if I had to describe Braincraft, what words would I use? I think generous, efficient, and creative. So the next step is to hire and partner with people who have similar core values.
How do we gauge these values? Creativity, for example, goes much beyond a portfolio, right? Creative people, when pitching for a project or wanting to get hired, do what it takes to reach and connect with the person who will be hiring them. They're very savvy in getting things done.
In an hour of interaction, it's often hard to tell who's the right person for the job and who isn't. I mean, if skills were all we needed, they're not exactly hard to come by. But we need these values and behaviors to align. And that in turn is a factor of how well the hiring or engagement conversation goes.
And there's so much that's been said about how we understand not just the words, but also the movement, the posture, the hand gestures, and the vibe, for lack of a better word. There was an instance quite recently where I had the opportunity to listen in on a hiring call. And this was happening over the phone, so there were no visual cues whatsoever. The person on the other end seemed to be highly skilled and knowledgeable, but something about their tone was simply not sitting well with me. And when I thought about it later, I realized that this person was bringing a certain amount of forcefulness to the conversation, which I felt was probably not required. Now, this may seem like a very subjective assessment to make, but that's exactly what the hiring process is all about, right?
I get what you mean. And this is quite the unpopular opinion in the sense that no one talks about it. But we do hire with our gut. And I remember the call that you're talking about. And it's probably not just the fact that it didn't sit well with you, it's also a red flag for the hiring manager. Will this person be open to other people's views? Will this person be a good listener? Or are they going to go with the view that they know it all? The question then is, how do we put our instincts to good use, particularly when we have no cues to go on? One thing that works for the leaders and founders I work with is also the simplest to implement. It is always a good idea today to ask for a video meeting when interviewing new people or starting on a new engagement with an agency or a freelancer or a partner company. It certainly helps to see people while talking to them and using this advantage for some informal conversation to flow too. The next step, especially when an external hiring agency is involved, is to ask them to filter aggressively based on some parameters such as picking up the call at the scheduled time, responding in coherent English when an email is sent, etc. These may seem like hygienic measures, but they save everyone time and filter out most people in the very first round.
Hmm. So the idea is to think of hiring as a two-step process. The first step is elimination, and the second one is the actual selection. To be honest, it is easier to work with a smaller pool of great candidates, particularly when hiring online. I also heard a friend mention a data science equation, and it's called the secretary problem, interestingly. It basically says that you meet your ideal candidate before or at the 37% mark in the hiring process. So if there are 10 people to interview and you already like someone among the first four, you should go ahead and just hire that person. It isn't to say that the other six will be terrible, but if you've already met the person you want to work with, every subsequent interview is only going to diminish in terms of returns.
That's an interesting statistic, especially in this world of FOMO and always fearing that you're missing out on something unless you speak to all 10 candidates. But if the numbers speak, we'll do well to believe them. Now, for the trickiest bit about hiring, which is hiring for values. There are companies that have their core values strongly in place and they know what they're looking for. The next step then is to maximize these values in the candidate you're hiring. Going back to the podcast at the table, we often have three key values in mind and compromise on one as long as two are met. However, if there ever is a time to not compromise on your core values, that is right now. These are the values that have kept these businesses going during a lockdown and bad economy. So, if Raincraft's values are generosity and efficiency and creativity, it is very tempting to hire someone who has two of these traits or to engage with someone who qualifies on two. But not having the third one automatically causes problems. Someone with no efficiency will have trouble keeping up with the agency life, however earnest they may be. Likewise, someone who is generous and efficient but lacks creativity may cause problems with clients or with their own team members when they can't come up with solutions for simple things or can't come up with different ways of doing something.
But then, how do we really gauge any of these traits on a Zoom call? I can imagine efficiency as something that could reflect in how someone speaks or structures their thoughts during a call. The other traits are tougher, but I think someone who's able to come up with a solution mindset and talk about how they solve problems and not about the problem itself is, in my mind, a good parameter for creativity. And especially if these things come up organically in a conversation, I think I would consider that a good conversation.
Yes, it is difficult. More so because very few people show up for an interview not wanting to make an impression. The subtler cues could help. How do they talk about their previous company? Is there a bit of generosity in that?
Irrespective of the kind of experience they've had there.
Oh, very much so. Irrespective of their experience, how they talk about it can give you many indicators. And another indicator of generosity is going out of their way on little things or being willing to think about it and coming back to you, right? I mean, as a freelancer or as an agency, we have multiple conversations in terms of what exactly we are engaging for and the scope. So I'd like someone who says, okay, we're agreeing for so much of content in a month, 3 blogs, plus or minus one. And there's a subtle bit of generosity there. But none of these factors can be applied across the board. And there's always the question of what happens when someone is highly skilled but lacks the ability to communicate some of these values. In such cases, I'd personally err on the side of caution, especially when engaging virtually. But none of this is to say that every potential employee needs to do 10 interviews marvelously well. We're all human. Just being authentic is often a game changer.
And it's action time. Subha, can we list out three things our listeners can do to hire better or to land a gig better in the virtual context?
Always start with your company's core values. These become the basis for all engagement conversations. As an individual, look at your own core values, and this is what needs to be in sync. Then, ask for video meetings. Mention this upfront, but also offer to reschedule once given the circumstances today. Third, continue to use and interpret the subtler cues, except that now you also tie them in with your or the company's values and culture.
That sounds like a plan and certainly more doable than going into a hiring conversation blind. And with that, we are ready to wrap up this episode of Small Talk. What has your virtual hiring experience or how has it been like to land a gig this year? Send us a voice note at speakpipe.com/raincraft or write to us at connect@raincraft.in. If you loved this episode, please share it with your team and we'll see you next time.